The desert wind whipped across the barren landscape of southern Arizona, carrying with it the scent of sage and the promise of another scorching day. Rebecca Martinez wiped the sweat from her brow as she surveyed the small plot of land she had purchased with her life savings. 3 acres of seemingly worthless desert that most people would consider uninhabitable. But Rebecca wasn't most people. After losing her job as a graphic designer in Phoenix and going through a bitter divorce that left her with almost nothing, she had made a decision that shocked everyone who knew her. She would build her own home from scratch, using nothing but her own 2 hands and sheer determination. The morning sun cast long shadows across the desert floor as Rebecca unloaded another batch of reclaimed lumber from her beaten-up pickup truck. She had been living in a small travel trailer on the property for 3 months now, saving every penny she could while teaching herself construction techniques through YouTube videos and library books. Her ex-husband David had laughed when she told him about her plan, calling it another one of Rebecca's crazy schemes. Her parents had begged her to move back to their house in Tucson, unable to understand why their daughter would choose this harsh existence over the comfort of suburban life. But Rebecca had her reasons. The divorce had been brutal, with David managing to keep most of their shared assets through legal maneuvering that left her feeling powerless and betrayed. She had spent 15 years building what she thought was a solid marriage, only to discover that David had been having an affair with his secretary for the better part of 3 years. The revelation had shattered not just her heart, but her entire sense of self-worth. She needed to prove to herself that she could create something beautiful and lasting with her own hands, something that nobody could take away from her. The cabin she envisioned wasn't grand by any means, just a simple one-room structure with a loft for sleeping, a small kitchen area, and a wood-burning stove for heat. She had drawn up the plans herself, modeling it after the tiny houses she had seen online, but adapting the design for the harsh desert climate. The foundation had been the hardest part so far, requiring her to dig by hand in the rocky soil and mix concrete in a wheelbarrow. Her hands, once soft from years of office work, were now calloused and scarred, but she wore those marks like badges of honor. As she began laying out the lumber for the day's work on the frame, Rebecca noticed a figure watching her from about 50 yards away. An elderly Native American man sat on horseback, silhouetted against the morning sky. She had seen him a few times before over the past weeks, always at a distance, never approaching. The locals had told her that this area had historical significance to the Apache people, and she wondered if she was somehow intruding on sacred land. She waved tentatively, but the man didn't respond, simply continuing to observe her work. Rebecca turned her attention back to the task at hand, using a circular saw to cut 2x4s to the precise measurements she had calculated. Each cut had to be perfect. She couldn't afford to waste materials. Every board had been carefully selected from construction sites that were throwing away perfectly good lumber, and every nail had been counted. She had exactly enough materials to complete the cabin if she made no mistakes, with perhaps a few boards to spare for unexpected problems. The work was backbreaking, especially for someone who had spent the last 15 years behind a desk. Rebecca had to teach herself how to use power tools, how to read a level, how to ensure that corners were perfectly square. She made mistakes, plenty of them. Sometimes she would spend an entire day building a wall section, only to discover that evening that her measurements were off by an inch, forcing her to tear it down and start over. But each mistake taught her something new, and slowly, painfully, her skills improved. By noon, the desert heat had become almost unbearable. Rebecca took refuge in the shade of her trailer, drinking water and eating a simple sandwich while reviewing her plans for the afternoon. She had developed a routine over the past weeks: work from dawn until the heat became too intense, rest during the hottest part of the day, then resume work in the late afternoon until darkness fell. It was a lonely existence, but she found a strange peace in the solitude and the rhythmic nature of the work. As she prepared to resume building, Rebecca noticed that the horseman was closer now, perhaps 30 yards away. This time, when she looked in his direction, he raised his hand in what might have been a greeting. She waved back more confidently, and to her surprise, he began walking his horse toward her. Rebecca felt a flutter of nervousness. She had always been respectful of the local Native American communities, but she wondered if he was coming to tell her that she shouldn't be here. The man appeared to be in his 70s, with weathered skin and long gray hair braided down his back. He wore a simple flannel shirt and jeans, and his horse was a beautiful paint with distinctive markings. When he was close enough to speak without shouting, he dismounted and approached her work area, examining the partially constructed frame with what appeared to be professional interest. "You're building this yourself," he said. It wasn't a question. "Yes, sir," Rebecca replied, unsure of the proper protocol for this situation. "I hope I'm not disturbing anything important. I checked with the county before I bought the land, and they said it was okay to build here." The man nodded slowly, walking around the frame and examining her work from different angles. Rebecca watched nervously, wondering what he was thinking. She had put her heart and soul into this project, and the thought that she might be doing something culturally insensitive made her stomach churn. "My name is Joseph Crow Feather," he said finally. "My grandfather used to hunt in this area when I was a boy. There's a spring about a quarter-mile north of here that was a traditional camping spot for our people." Rebecca's heart sank. "I'm so sorry, I had no idea. If I need to move the cabin, I will. I don't want to disrespect your traditions." Joseph smiled for the first time since approaching. "The spring is not on your land, and this spot was never ceremonial. You're not causing any problems." He paused, examining one of her wall sections more closely. "But you are causing problems for yourself. This corner is not square, and your foundation is about 2 inches off level on the north side." Rebecca felt her cheeks burn with embarrassment. She had been so proud of her progress, and now a stranger was pointing out flaws that she hadn't even noticed. "I'm still learning," she said quietly. "I've never done anything like this before." "I can see that," Joseph said, but his tone wasn't unkind. "I can also see that you're determined. Most people would have given up by now." He walked over to where she had her tools laid out and picked up her level, checking the foundation where he had indicated the problem. "You're going to have structural issues if you keep building on this foundation. The whole cabin will settle unevenly, and you'll have problems with doors and windows." Rebecca stared at the partially completed frame, feeling the weight of weeks of work potentially going to waste. "How bad is it? Do I have to start over completely?" Joseph considered the question carefully, walking around the structure again and taking measurements with his eyes in the way that only experienced builders could. "Not completely, but you'll need to tear down what you've built and fix the foundation before you go any further. It's better to do it right now than to try to fix it later." The thought of tearing down weeks of progress made Rebecca want to cry, but she knew he was right. She had felt something was slightly off about the way the walls were fitting together, but she had convinced herself that it was just her inexperience. "I guess I better get started then," she said, reaching for her crowbar. "Hold on," Joseph said, raising his hand. "It's too hot to do that kind of work right now, and you'll work faster with help." He looked at her for a long moment, as if making some kind of internal decision. "I'm retired, and my grandson thinks I need more hobbies. If you don't mind an old man giving you advice, I could come by a few mornings a week and help you learn to do this properly." Rebecca stared at him in amazement. "You would do that? Why?" Joseph was quiet for a moment, looking out across the desert landscape. "My grandfather used to say that the land calls to certain people. You've been out here for months, working in the heat, making mistakes and fixing them, never giving up. That tells me something about your character." He turned back to her. "Besides, I haven't built anything in years, and my hands are getting restless." "I can't pay you much," Rebecca said honestly. "I'm using every penny I have just for materials." "I'm not looking for money," Joseph replied. "But I wouldn't say no to some of that coffee I smell coming from your trailer." And so began an unlikely partnership that would change both of their lives in ways neither could have imagined. A second part. 3 weeks had passed since Joseph Crow Feather had first offered his help, and the transformation in both Rebecca's cabin and her skills was remarkable. Every Tuesday and Thursday morning, just as the sun began to peek over the mountains, Joseph would arrive on horseback, dismount near the growing structure, and begin the day by examining the previous day's work with the careful eye of a master craftsman. Rebecca had initially been intimidated by his expertise. Joseph, she learned, had spent 40 years as a general contractor before retiring, building everything from custom homes in Scottsdale to community centers on the reservation. His weathered hands could cut a perfect angle without measuring twice, and he could spot a structural problem from across the job site. But despite his obvious skill, he never made Rebecca feel incompetent. Instead, he taught her the way his own grandfather had taught him, through patience, demonstration, and stories. "Building is like life," Joseph told her one morning as they worked together to frame the cabin's single window. "You can't rush the foundation because everything else depends on it being solid. And you can't hide poor workmanship. It always shows itself eventually." Under Joseph's guidance, Rebecca had torn down the crooked frame and spent a full week correcting the foundation issues. It had been frustrating work, but Joseph had shown her how to use a water level to ensure perfect alignment and taught her tricks for working with the uneven desert terrain. Now, as they raised the walls of the cabin, every joint was tight, every corner was square, and every beam was perfectly level. The work had changed Rebecca's relationship with her own capabilities. 6 months ago, she had been a woman who called a handyman to hang pictures. Now she could operate a compound miter saw with confidence, understand the structural requirements of load-bearing walls, and solve complex geometric problems related to roof pitch and rafter placement. Her body had changed too. Her arms and shoulders had developed lean muscle, her hands had become steady and sure, and her stamina had increased dramatically. But perhaps more importantly, her confidence had begun to return. Each perfectly cut board, each wall that went up straight and true, each problem solved through careful thinking and hard work, rebuilt something inside her that the divorce had torn down. She was proving to herself that she could create something beautiful and lasting, something that was entirely her own. Joseph noticed the change in her demeanor as much as in her carpentry skills. When he had first approached her that morning weeks ago, Rebecca had carried herself like someone who expected to fail. Now she moved with purpose and spoke with the quiet confidence of someone who had tested herself and found that she was stronger than she had ever imagined. "You're thinking like a builder now," Joseph observed one morning as Rebecca carefully measured the spacing for roof rafters. "When I first saw you, you were just trying not to make mistakes. Now you're planning 3 steps ahead." Rebecca smiled, feeling a warmth that had nothing to do with the desert sun. "I feel like I'm finally learning something that matters. When I was doing graphic design, I was always worried about client preferences and market trends. This is different. Wood doesn't lie and physics doesn't care about opinions. If I do the work right, the cabin will stand. If I don't, it won't. There's something honest about that." As the cabin's walls reached their full height and they began to prepare for the roof installation, Rebecca found herself looking forward to Joseph's visits for reasons beyond just the construction help. His stories about growing up on the reservation, his decades of building experience, and his philosophical approach to craftsmanship had become as valuable to her as his technical instruction. He told her about the traditional Apache techniques for building shelters, about the importance of orienting structures to work with natural forces rather than against them, and about the spiritual significance of creating a home with one's own hands. In the old days, Joseph said one morning as they cut rafters, a person's dwelling was a reflection of their relationship with the world around them. It was built to last only as long as it was needed, and when it was time to move on, it returned to the earth without leaving scars. But it was also built to provide everything necessary for a good life: shelter, warmth, a place for family to gather. Your cabin is like that. It's exactly what you need, nothing more and nothing less. Rebecca had never thought about her project in those terms, but she realized Joseph was right. The cabin was small by modern standards, just 400 square feet, but every inch had been carefully planned to serve a purpose. The single room would serve as living area, kitchen and workspace, with a loft above for sleeping. The south-facing windows would provide natural light and passive solar heating in winter, while deep eaves would provide shade in summer. A covered porch would extend the living space and provide a place to sit and watch the desert sunsets. As they worked on installing the metal roofing that Rebecca had chosen for its durability and fire resistance, Joseph began sharing more personal stories. He told her about his late wife, Maria, who had died 5 years earlier after a long battle with cancer. He spoke about his children, who had moved to cities for work and visited less frequently than he would like. He talked about the loneliness of retirement and the strange feeling of having hands that wanted to build, but no projects that needed building. "When I saw you out here," Joseph said as they secured the last sheet of roofing, "working in the heat, making mistakes but not giving up, it reminded me of myself when I was young. I built my first house when I was 22, right after Maria and I got married. I thought I knew everything there was to know about construction, but that house taught me how much I still had to learn." Rebecca paused in her work, sensing that this story was important. "What happened with the house?" Joseph smiled, but there was sadness in his eyes. "I made every mistake you could imagine. The foundation settled unevenly, the roof leaked, the windows didn't fit properly. Maria was pregnant with our first child, and we were living in this house that seemed determined to fall down around us. I spent the first 2 years of our marriage fixing problems that I had created through inexperience and pride. But you figured it out eventually." "Eventually," Joseph agreed. "But more importantly, I learned that building something good requires patience, humility, and the wisdom to ask for help when you need it. Maria used to say that our marriage was like that house. It required constant attention and maintenance, but if you put in the work, it would shelter you through any storm. Rebecca felt a pang of sadness thinking about her own failed marriage. I don't think David and I ever learned that lesson. We just expected everything to work without putting in the effort. Joseph was quiet for a moment, adjusting a roof panel to ensure perfect alignment. Some people are builders, and some people are just tenants. Tenants expect someone else to fix the problems. Builders take responsibility for making things work. As the afternoon wore on and they completed the roof installation, Rebecca realized that she was dreading the day when the cabin would be finished and Joseph's visits would end. Over the past weeks, she had come to value not just his construction expertise, but his friendship and wisdom. He had become the father figure she had never really had, patient, encouraging, and full of practical knowledge about both building and life. But as if reading her thoughts, Joseph brought up a subject that surprised her. You know, this cabin is going to need furniture, and I've been thinking about building some pieces that would fit the space properly. Built-in bookshelves, a dining table that could double as a work surface, maybe a bed frame for the loft. If you're interested, I could start on those once we finish the main structure. Rebecca's face lit up. You would want to do that. I've been thinking about it, Joseph said, gathering his tools as the day's work came to an end. I'm too old to take on big construction projects anymore, but furniture work would be perfect. Besides, I'd like to see this project through to completion. You've put too much heart into this place to furnish it with store-bought furniture that doesn't fit. As Joseph mounted his horse and prepared to leave for the day, Rebecca felt a deep sense of gratitude that went beyond words. This man, who owed her nothing, had given her not just the skills to build her cabin, but the confidence to believe in herself again. He had shown her that strength came not from being perfect, but from being willing to learn from mistakes and keep moving forward. Standing beside her nearly completed cabin, Rebecca watched Joseph ride away into the desert sunset. The structure around her was solid, weatherproof, and beautiful in its simplicity. But more than that, it was proof that she could overcome any challenge if she was willing to put in the work. Tomorrow, they would begin work on the interior finishing, and soon she would have the home she had dreamed of, a place that was entirely her own, built with her own hands and filled with the wisdom of an unexpected friendship. A third part. The morning air carried a hint of autumn coolness as Rebecca stepped onto the newly completed porch of her cabin, coffee mug in hand, and surveyed the finished structure that had consumed her life for the past 8 months. The cabin stood solid and proud against the desert landscape, its metal roof gleaming in the early sunlight and its natural wood siding already beginning to weather to a beautiful silver gray. Every board, every nail, Every carefully measured angle represented hours of labor, mistakes corrected, and skills hard-won through determination and Joseph's patient instruction. Inside, the cabin was everything Rebecca had dreamed it would be. Joseph had spent the past month crafting custom furniture pieces that fit the space perfectly, built-in bookshelves that followed the natural contours of the walls, a dining table that could be folded down from the wall when not in use, and a beautiful platform bed in the loft that incorporated storage drawers beneath. The wood-burning stove that would heat the cabin through the winter months sat ready in the corner, its chimney pipe extending through the roof, in a configuration that Joseph had designed to maximize heat efficiency. Rebecca had moved out of the travel trailer 3 weeks ago, and each morning she woke up in the loft feeling a deep sense of accomplishment and peace. The cabin was small, but it contained everything she needed for a simple, comfortable life. The kitchen area, though compact, was efficiently designed with propane appliances and sufficient counter space for cooking. The living area, dominated by Joseph's handcrafted bookshelves, and a comfortable reading chair positioned near the large south-facing window, had become her favorite space for morning coffee and evening reflection. But on this particular morning, Rebecca's peaceful routine was interrupted by the sound of vehicles approaching on the dirt road that led to her property. Through the window, she could see a white pickup truck followed by a sedan, both displaying official county markings. Her stomach clenched with anxiety as she recognized the lead vehicle. It belonged to Marcus Thompson, the county building inspector who had been making her life difficult for the past several weeks. Thompson was a man in his 40s who seemed to take personal pleasure in finding fault with anything that didn't conform to his rigid interpretation of building codes. He had visited Rebecca's property twice during construction, each time finding minor issues to complain about and threatening to halt the project if she didn't address his concerns immediately. Joseph had warned her that Thompson had a reputation for being particularly harsh with owner-built projects, seemingly viewing them as challenges to his authority rather than legitimate construction efforts. Rebecca had followed every building code requirement to the letter, had submitted detailed plans for approval, and had even hired a licensed electrician to install the cabin's minimal electrical system to ensure it met all safety standards. But Thompson seemed determined to find something wrong, and his previous visits had left Rebecca feeling harassed and intimidated. As the vehicles pulled up near the cabin, Rebecca forced herself to remain calm and walked outside to greet the officials. Thompson emerged from his truck carrying a clipboard and wearing the expression of someone who expected to find violations. Behind him came a woman Rebecca didn't recognize, carrying what appeared to be legal documents. "Ms. Martinez," Thompson said without preamble, "I'm here to conduct a final inspection of your structure. This is Janet Crawford from the county attorney's office. Rebecca felt her anxiety spike. The presence of a county attorney suggested this was more than a routine inspection. "Good morning," she said, working to keep her voice steady. "The cabin is ready for inspection. I have all the permits and documentation you requested." Thompson didn't respond to her greeting, instead walking around the cabin's exterior and making notes on his clipboard. Rebecca watched nervously as he examined the foundation, the siding, the roofing, and the chimney installation. She knew the work was solid. Joseph had insisted on construction methods that exceeded code requirements. But Thompson's demeanor suggested he was looking for problems rather than verifying compliance. After 20 minutes of exterior examination, Thompson approached the cabin's front door. "I need to inspect the interior now," he announced. Rebecca led them inside, proud despite her nervousness of the beautiful space she and Joseph had created. The cabin was warm and inviting, with morning sunlight streaming through the windows and highlighting the natural wood surfaces that Joseph had finished with such care. Every element of the interior met or exceeded building code requirements, from the properly installed smoke detectors to the GFCI outlets in the kitchen area. But as Thompson moved through the space, Rebecca could see that he was focusing on details that seemed designed to create problems rather than ensure safety. He measured the ceiling height in the loft area multiple times, checked the width of the stairs leading to the sleeping area, and spent an excessive amount of time examining the wood stove installation that had been inspected and approved by a certified professional. "Ms. Martinez," Thompson said finally, "I'm finding several code violations that need to be addressed immediately." Rebecca's heart sank. What violations? Everything was built according to the approved plans, and the electrical and stove installations were done by licensed professionals. Thompson consulted his clipboard with an expression of satisfaction. "The loft area doesn't meet minimum ceiling height requirements in certain sections. The stairs to the loft are 2 inches narrower than code requires, and the overall square footage appears to be different from what was indicated on your approved plans." Rebecca stared at him in disbelief. "The loft ceiling follows the natural slope of the roof, which was clearly shown on the approved plans. The stair width was specifically approved in your office when I submitted the detailed drawings, and the square footage is exactly what was approved, 400 square feet. I'll need to verify these measurements myself," Thompson said, pulling out a measuring tape. As he worked, Rebecca noticed that he seemed to be measuring in ways that would produce the most unfavorable results, stretching the tape at angles that didn't reflect the actual usable space. Janet Crawford, who had remained silent during the inspection, now spoke up. "Ms. Martinez, based on these findings, the county is prepared to issue a stop-use order on this structure until the violations are corrected. Additionally, we've received a complaint that this construction project has been proceeding without proper oversight. A complaint from whom? Rebecca asked, though she had a sinking feeling she already knew the answer. Crawford consulted her own paperwork. The complaint was filed by David Martinez, who claims to have knowledge of code violations and safety concerns related to this project. Rebecca felt as if she had been punched in the stomach. David, her ex-husband, who had laughed at her plan to build the cabin, who had done everything possible to make the divorce proceedings difficult and expensive, was now trying to destroy the one thing she had built for herself. She realized that this harassment wasn't about building codes at all. It was about David's desire to control and punish her even after their marriage had ended. My ex-husband has no expertise in construction and no legitimate reason to file such a complaint, Rebecca said, working to keep her voice steady despite her anger. This appears to be harassment related to our divorce proceedings. Thompson shrugged, clearly unconcerned with the personal dynamics involved. Regardless of the source, we're required to investigate all complaints. Based on my inspection, I'm issuing citations for the violations I've identified. You have 30 days to correct these issues, or the county will begin legal proceedings to have the structure condemned. As Rebecca stared at the citations Thompson handed her, she felt the weight of months of work and sacrifice potentially being destroyed by bureaucratic pettiness and her ex-husband's vindictiveness. The violations Thompson had identified seemed arbitrary and designed to create expensive solutions. Lowering certain sections of the loft ceiling would require major structural changes. Widening the stairs would necessitate rebuilding the entire staircase, and challenging the square footage measurements would require expensive surveyor verification. After the officials left, Rebecca sat on her porch steps feeling overwhelmed and defeated. She had put everything she had into this project, her savings, her physical strength, her emotional energy, and now it was being threatened by people who seemed determined to find fault regardless of the actual quality and safety of her work. But as she sat there contemplating the seemingly impossible task of fighting the county bureaucracy, she heard the familiar sound of hoofbeats approaching. Joseph Crow Feather rode up to the cabin, dismounted, and immediately noticed the distress on Rebecca's face. "What happened?" he asked simply. Rebecca handed him the citations and explained the morning's events. As Joseph read through Thompson's list of violations, his expression grew increasingly dark. When Rebecca mentioned David's complaint, Joseph's jaw tightened in a way that suggested barely controlled anger. "These citations are garbage," Joseph said finally. "Thompson is either incompetent or corrupt, and probably both. Every one of these supposed violations is based on misreading the approved plans or measuring things incorrectly. But how do I fight it? Rebecca asked. I can't afford a lawyer, and Thompson clearly has it in for me. Even if I could prove he's wrong, he'll just find other problems. Joseph was quiet for a long moment, studying the citations and thinking. When he finally spoke, there was a steel in his voice that Rebecca had never heard before. Thompson has been pulling this kind of thing for years, but he's finally picked on the wrong person. I've been building in this county for 40 years, and I know every code requirement better than he does. More importantly, I know people who can help us fight this. Rebecca looked at him hopefully. What kind of people? Joseph smiled, but it wasn't a pleasant expression. The kind of people who don't like bullies, especially bullies who abuse their authority to settle personal grudges. Thompson may think he has the power here, but he's about to learn that there are consequences for targeting good people. The fourth part. The conference room in the county administration building buzzed with an energy that Marcus Thompson clearly hadn't expected when he'd called this meeting to discuss Rebecca's compliance issues. Thompson sat at one end of the long table, flanked by Janet Crawford from the county attorney's office and his supervisor, Building Department Director Corinne Walsh. But the other side of the table told a very different story than the simple code enforcement hearing Thompson had anticipated. Joseph Crow Feather sat directly across from Thompson, wearing a crisp button-down shirt and bolo tie, his long gray hair neatly braided. Next to him sat Rebecca, dressed in her best clothes but still showing the calloused hands and sun-weathered skin of someone who worked outdoors. But the real surprise for Thompson was the presence of two other men who had arrived with Joseph and Rebecca. Robert Bobby Yazzie was a member of the County Board of Supervisors and a lifelong friend of Joseph's. At 65, Bobby had the bearing of someone accustomed to authority, and his presence at this meeting signaled that Rebecca's situation had gained political attention. Next to Bobby sat James Mitchell, a retired county building inspector who had trained Thompson years earlier and was now working as a private consultant specializing in building code disputes. Thompson's confidence had visibly eroded as these additional participants filed into the room. What he had expected to be a simple administrative procedure forcing Rebecca to make expensive modifications or abandon her cabin had become something much more complicated. "Let's begin," Walsh said, consulting her notes. "Mr. Thompson, please present your findings regarding the Martinez property." Thompson cleared his throat and began reading from his inspection report, detailing the same violations he had cited at Rebecca's cabin. But as he spoke, Rebecca noticed that his voice lacked the certainty it had held during his on-site inspection. The presence of Bobby Yazzie and James Mitchell seemed to have shaken his confidence. When Thompson finished his presentation, James Mitchell asked for permission to respond. Walsh nodded, and the retired inspector opened a folder containing detailed photographs and measurements. "I visited the Martinez property yesterday at the request of Mr. Crow Feather," Mitchell began. "I've reviewed the approved plans, examined the construction methods, and taken precise measurements of every area cited in Mr. Thompson's report. I find his conclusions to be factually incorrect and inconsistent with county building codes." Mitchell spread photographs across the table, each one annotated with precise measurements and code references. The loft ceiling height varies from 6 feet 8 inches to 7 feet 3 inches, which exceeds the minimum requirement of 6 feet 6 inches for sleeping areas. The stairs are 34 inches wide, which meets the 32-inch minimum requirement for residential structures. And the total square footage is exactly 400 square feet, as indicated on the approved plans. Thompson's face had grown red during Mitchell's presentation. "I stand by my measurements," he said defensively. "The structure doesn't meet code requirements." "Then perhaps you could explain these discrepancies," Mitchell said, pulling out a second set of photographs. "These images show the areas where you took your measurements, based on the marks left by your measuring tape. In each case, you measured at angles or positions that would produce artificially low readings." Walsh leaned forward, studying the photographs. "Mr. Thompson, can you explain why your measurements differ so significantly from Mr. Mitchell's?" Thompson fumbled for an explanation, but before he could respond, Bobby Yazzie spoke for the first time since entering the room. "I think we need to address the broader pattern here," Bobby said, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to being heard. "This isn't the first complaint we've received about Mr. Thompson's inspection practices. In the past year, my office has fielded calls from 6 different property owners who felt they were being unfairly targeted." Janet Crawford looked uncomfortable. "Supervisor Yazzie, are you suggesting impropriety in the building inspection process?" "I'm suggesting that when an inspector consistently finds violations that other qualified professionals cannot verify, it raises questions about competence or motivation," Bobby replied. "And when those questionable inspections disproportionately target owner-built projects and small property owners, it raises questions about bias." Joseph had remained silent during the technical discussion, but now he leaned forward and placed a thick folder on the table. "I've brought documentation of Mr. Thompson's inspection history," he said quietly. "Over the past 3 years, he has issued violation notices to 12 owner-builder projects. In every case, the violations were later determined to be unfounded when challenged by qualified professionals." Walsh opened the folder and began scanning the documents. Rebecca could see her expression growing more troubled as she read. "Mr. Thompson, Are you familiar with these cases? Thompson's defensive posture had crumbled into something approaching panic. Some property owners just don't understand code requirements, he said weakly. My job is to ensure public safety. Your job, Mitchell interjected, is to fairly and accurately enforce building codes. Deliberately measuring incorrectly or misinterpreting approved plans doesn't serve public safety. It serves some other agenda. The room fell silent as the implications of Mitchell's statement settled over everyone present. Rebecca felt a surge of hope mixed with anger as she realized that Thompson's harassment wasn't just unfair. It was potentially actionable misconduct. Bobby Yazzie broke the silence. There's another matter we need to address. We've learned that Mr. Thompson's inspection of the Martinez property was prompted by a complaint from her ex-husband. Given the personal nature of that relationship and the contentious divorce proceedings, there are serious questions about whether Mr. Thompson should have recused himself from this case. Crawford consulted her legal pad. Mr. Thompson, were you aware of the personal relationship between the complainant and the property owner? I may have been aware, Thompson admitted reluctantly, but we're required to investigate all complaints. You're required to investigate legitimate complaints, Walsh corrected. But you're also required to avoid situations where personal conflicts might influence your professional judgment. Using county resources to settle domestic disputes is a serious abuse of authority. Rebecca watched as Thompson's position became increasingly untenable. The man who had seemed so powerful and intimidating at her cabin now appeared small and defensive, his authority undermined by the presence of people who understood the system better than he did. Joseph finally spoke, his voice carrying the weight of decades in the construction industry. Marcus, I've known you since you started in this department. You used to be a fair inspector who cared about doing good work. I don't know what changed, but this stops now. Rebecca Martinez built a beautiful, safe cabin that exceeds code requirements in every respect. She did it with her own hands, on her own time, with her own money. She deserves respect for that accomplishment, not harassment from someone who's supposed to protect the public interest. The rebuke seemed to hit Thompson harder than all the technical arguments that had preceded it. For a moment, Rebecca saw something like shame in his expression. Walsh closed the folder of documentation and addressed the room. Based on the evidence presented here, I'm withdrawing all citations against the Martinez property. The structure meets all applicable building codes and is approved for occupancy. She turned to Thompson. Mr. Thompson, you'll be placed on administrative leave pending a full investigation into your inspection practices. As the meeting concluded and participants began filing out of the room, Rebecca felt overwhelmed by gratitude and relief. The threat to her cabin had been eliminated, but more importantly, she had learned that standing up to bullies was possible when good people were willing to help. Outside the building, Bobby Yazzie shook Rebecca's hand warmly. "I'm sorry you had to go through this," he said, "but I'm glad it's given us the opportunity to address a problem that's been brewing for too long." James Mitchell echoed the sentiment. "Your cabin is a credit to owner-builder construction. I hope this experience doesn't discourage you from future projects." As the others departed, Rebecca found herself alone with Joseph beside his truck. "I don't know how to thank you," she said. "You saved everything I worked for." Joseph smiled, the first genuine smile she had seen from him all day. "You saved it yourself by building something worth defending. I just helped you find the right people to tell your story to." 6 months later, Rebecca stood on her porch watching the sunset paint the desert sky in brilliant oranges and purples. The cabin had become everything she had hoped it would be: a sanctuary, a symbol of her independence, and proof of her own capabilities. Thompson had been terminated from his position after the investigation revealed a pattern of misconduct, and his replacement had visited Rebecca's property to formally apologize for the county's treatment of her project. But perhaps more importantly, the experience had connected Rebecca to a community she hadn't known existed. Joseph's visits had evolved from construction consultation to genuine friendship, and through him, she had met other owner-builders, craftspeople, and independent spirits who chose to live on their own terms.